We have breaking news. The U.S. Supreme Court has blocked the Trump administration from deploying the National Guard in Illinois. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled they will not allow the White House to deploy National Guard troops to the Chicago area as a legal challenge moves forward. CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camila Montoya-Galvez joins us now. Camila, what did the justices say in this decision? And is this sort of a stay or is this on the merits?
Well, to justify his attempts to deploy the National Guard to Chicago, Portland, and Los Angeles and other cities across the country, the President Lindsay has argued that violent protesters are obstructing and interfering with federal immigration operations, including by ICE and Border Patrol, and that the National Guard is needed in these Democratic-led cities to protect immigration agents and also facilities where detainees are held. In this case, specifically focused on the Chicago area attempted deployment, the majority of the High Court has said that the Trump administration actually did not meet the requirements in the federal law it cited to justify the deployment of the Guard there in Illinois.
What's up, world? This is Adam. Trump deployed National Guard troops to Chicago without state consent, sparking a federal legal battle over executive overreach. The move, which bypassed local and state authority, has raised alarms about the use of military force against American cities. So, let's break down exactly what's unfolding, because this story is massive, and most people have no idea how deep it goes. President Trump has set his sights on deploying National Guard troops to cities like Chicago, cities that have made it abundantly clear they want nothing to do with federal military intervention. The governors are pushing back hard, the courts have gotten involved, and now the Supreme Court of the United States is being forced to answer a question that cuts to the very heart of American democracy. Can a president unilaterally send federal forces into states that are screaming no? Let that sink in for a moment because it's absolutely wild. The highest court in the land is about to rule on whether the commander-in-chief can deploy troops on American soil against the wishes of state governments. The case is called Trump vs. Illinois, and the outcome could redefine presidential power in ways we haven't witnessed since perhaps the civil rights era, or maybe in ways we've never seen at all.
Welcome back. We are following breaking news out of the Supreme Court, which has just blocked the Trump administration from deploying the National Guard in Illinois. The justices rejecting the White House's claim that the troops were needed to protect federal agents carrying out immigration enforcement, particularly in and around the Chicago area. The decision represents a rare defeat for this administration by this conservative-leaning court. Joining me now is NBC News senior Supreme Court reporter Lawrence Hurley. So, Lawrence, what did the justices say in their ruling?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, this is a pretty significant setback for the Trump administration because the court was saying here that this law that the Trump administration was trying to use to deploy National Guard in Chicago basically couldn't be used at this point because that law says the president can deploy the National Guard when the regular forces are unable to execute the laws. And the court said regular forces doesn't refer to local police. It refers to the U.S. military. And even if you could try to bring in the U.S. military to do this.
Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, if there's crime and chaos, doesn't the president need to step in? And honestly, that's a fair question. But here's the thing. The lower courts have already examined Trump's national security claims, and they called them something pretty damning. They said his justifications were wildly exaggerated. That's not me saying it. That's federal judges. They looked at the evidence, or lack thereof, and concluded that Trump was stretching the truth to justify a power grab. But Trump's legal team, they're not backing down. They're arguing that the president has exclusive discretion under the law to determine troop use within U.S. borders. Exclusive discretion. That's a fancy legal term that basically means the president can do whatever he wants and nobody can stop him. And constitutional scholars are sounding the alarm because if the Supreme Court agrees with Trump, we're not just talking about sending troops to Chicago. We're talking about a precedent that would allow any future president to deploy military forces into cities, counties, states, anywhere they want, regardless of what local leaders say.
President Trump has backed down on his plans to send the National Guard to Chicago for now. Instead, the president told Fox News today that federal troops will be deployed to a different city.
We're going to Memphis. I'm just announcing that now, and we'll straighten that out.
National Guard?
National Guard and anybody else we need. And by the way, we'll bring in the military, too, if we need it.
President Trump said both the state's Republican governor and Memphis's Democratic mayor were happy about these developments. But the mayor had something different to say this afternoon.
I want to be clear, I did not ask for the National Guard, and I don't think it's the way to drive down crime. My commitment is to make sure that we work strategically to ensure that this happens in a way that truly benefits and strengthens our community.
According to last year's FBI crime data, Memphis was ranked #1 for the most incidents of violent crime per 100,000 residents.
Governor Gavin Newsom isn't holding back either. He's calling this what it is, an illegal and authoritarian power grab. Those are strong words from a sitting governor, but when you look at what's actually being argued in this case, can you really blame him? Newsom and other governors are warning that if Trump wins this case, it sets the stage for federal military control over local governments. Think about that for a second. Federal military control over local governments? That's not hyperbole. That's the logical conclusion of Trump's legal argument. And here's where it gets even more concerning. There's a new report out that says the Supreme Court's conservative majority has ruled in Trump's favor in over 90% of cases since his second term began. 90%. That's a staggering number, and it's causing people to ask some pretty uncomfortable questions about judicial independence. Are we watching the court do its job, or are we watching the court rubber stamp whatever the president wants? Because let's be real, this case isn't happening in isolation.
If President Trump deploys the National Guard to your home city, San Francisco, what are you going to do?
Well, I mean, it appears that business leaders, folks he listens to, told him not to do that.
But he hasn't fully pulled back the option.
I mean, for obvious reasons, because San Francisco it's on its path to have 70-year low homicide rate, 60-year low last year. I mean, double-digit decline in crime across the spectrum in the last couple of years. You've seen the improvement. I mean, we're the center of the universe in terms of artificial intelligence, quite literally the center of the universe, and startups and innovation, entrepreneurialism. This city's coming back in a big, big way. He couldn't even make up a pretense for this. No protests going on. There's nothing happening. It was laughable. That's why we had the lawsuit ready to go. To your question, my answer, lawsuit's ready to go. We already had 43 lawsuits. It's only been 40 weeks of this presidency. That would have been 44. Second he does it, we'll be in court.
Trump has been pushing the boundaries of executive authority since day one of his second term, firing federal regulators, restricting birthright citizenship, and now deploying troops into cities that don't want them. Each move pushes the envelope a little further. But this Supreme Court case could be the one that tears the envelope wide open. Why does this matter right now? Well, for one thing, we're heading into the 2026 midterms, and this case is going to become a massive flashpoint. Trump's whole brand is law and order leadership, but his opponents are calling this creeping authoritarianism. And depending on how the Supreme Court rules, one of those narratives is going to get a whole lot stronger. But beyond the politics, beyond the election cycle, this case could fundamentally reshape the balance of power between federal and state governments. It could rewrite the rules on what a president can and cannot do on American soil. And honestly, that should matter to every single person watching this, regardless of whether you love Trump or hate him. Because here's the deal. Maybe you trust Trump with this power. Maybe you think he'll use it responsibly. But what about the next president? What about the one after that? Once you hand over this kind of authority, you don't get to pick and choose who gets to use it. So yeah, buckle up, because the Supreme Court is about to make a decision that could change everything. And we need to talk about what's really at stake here, because it's way bigger than Chicago, way bigger than Trump. This is about the future of American democracy itself. And when I say this is unprecedented, I mean it. This is the first time the Supreme Court will directly rule on whether the president holds the authority to deploy federal forces domestically without state consent. The first time. We're in uncharted territory here. And the decision that comes down is going to echo for decades, maybe longer. So stick with me, because we're about to dive deep into this case, break down what's really being argued, and figure out what it means for every single American. Whether you live in a red state or a blue state, whether you support Trump or oppose him, this affects everyone. And most people have no idea just how big this really is. Let's get into the weeds here, because this case is absolutely loaded with constitutional drama. And honestly, most people don't fully understand what's actually being argued. The headlines make it sound simple, like Trump wants troops in Chicago and Illinois says no. But the legal battle underneath, that's where things get genuinely scary. So first, let's talk about how we even got here. Trump's been talking about crime in Democratic-run cities since forever. Chicago specifically has been a punching bag for him. High crime rates, gang violence, you know the talking points. And look, Chicago does have crime problems. That's not up for debate. But here's where Trump took a hard turn. Instead of working with state and local officials, instead of offering federal resources that the governor could accept or decline, Trump just decided he was going to deploy National Guard troops himself. No consultation, no state request, just I'm the president and I'm doing this. And Illinois governor basically said, no, you're not. And that's when the lawyers got involved. Now, Trump's legal argument is actually pretty audacious when you break it down. His team is saying that the president has inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to deploy military forces domestically to address threats to national security. And they're saying this authority is basically unlimited, that the president alone gets to decide what constitutes a threat and how to respond. But here's the problem. The Constitution doesn't actually give the president unlimited power to deploy troops on American soil. There are laws, old laws, specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of thing. Ever heard of the Posse Comitatus Act? It's from 1878, and it exists specifically to limit the president's ability to use military forces for domestic law enforcement. The whole point was to stop the federal government from using the army to enforce laws in states without proper authorization, because using the military to police your own citizens is kind of a hallmark of authoritarian regimes. Not exactly the American way, but Trump's lawyers have a workaround. They're arguing that National Guard troops, when federalized under Title X authority, aren't subject to Posse Comitatus restrictions in the same way regular Army troops are. And technically, they might have a point on that narrow legal question, but constitutional scholars are saying, okay, sure, but that doesn't mean the president can just deploy them wherever he wants for whatever reason he wants. The lower courts actually sided with Illinois on this. They looked at Trump's justification, his claims about imminent national security threats in Chicago, and they basically said, we're not buying it. One court specifically used the phrase wildly exaggerated, which coming from a federal judge is pretty damning. These courts said Trump was overreaching, that he was trying to use national security as a blanket excuse to do something he doesn't actually have the authority to do. So, Trump appealed, and now the Supreme Court has to decide. And here's where it gets really interesting or really terrifying depending on how you look at it. The Supreme Court right now has a 6-3 conservative majority. And as I mentioned earlier, there's reporting that this court has ruled in Trump's favor in over 90% of cases since his second term started. 90%. That's an insanely high number, and it's raising serious questions about whether this court is acting as an independent check on executive power or whether it's basically become an extension of the Trump administration. Now, some people will say that's just because Trump's legal positions happen to be correct and okay, maybe. But when you're winning 90% of your cases at the Supreme Court, that's not normal. That's not how checks and balances are supposed to work. Presidents are supposed to lose sometimes, especially when they're pushing the boundaries of their authority. In this case, Trump versus Illinois, this is about as boundary pushing as it gets. Because if the court rules in Trump's favor, if they say yes, the president can deploy federal troops into states without state consent, then we've just handed the executive branch a level of domestic military power that no president has had in modern American history. Think about what that means practically. It means a president could send troops into any city, any state, anytime he decides there's a problem that needs federal military intervention. Local mayor says no, doesn't matter. Governor says no, doesn't matter. State legislature passes a resolution opposing it, still doesn't matter. The president decides, and that's the end of the conversation. And sure, maybe you think Trump will use that power responsibly. Maybe you think he'd only deploy troops in genuinely dangerous situations. But again, this isn't just about Trump. This is about creating a precedent. Once the Supreme Court says a president has this authority, every future president has it too. Imagine a progressive president decides that climate protests in Texas have gotten out of hand and deploys federal troops to shut them down. Or imagine a future administration decides that a border state isn't cooperating with federal immigration policy, so troops get sent in to enforce compliance. Once you open this door, you can't control who walks through it. Governor Newsom gets this. That's why he's been so vocal. He's calling this case a potential turning point, saying it could fundamentally alter the relationship between federal and state governments. And he's not wrong. The 10th Amendment exists specifically to reserve powers to the states that aren't explicitly given to the federal government. Deploying military forces on domestic soil against the wishes of state leadership is a pretty massive encroachment on state sovereignty. There's also a historical angle here that people aren't talking about enough. The last time we had serious debates about federal troops on domestic soil was during the Civil Rights era, President Eisenhower sent troops to Little Rock to enforce school desegregation. JFK and LBJ deployed forces to protect civil rights marchers and enforce federal court orders. But here's the key difference. Those deployments happened because states were violating federal law, specifically constitutional rights. The federal government was enforcing the Constitution against states that were defying it. This situation is completely different. Illinois isn't violating federal law. Chicago isn't defying a court order. Trump just wants to send troops there because he thinks crime is too high. That's not a constitutional crisis. That's not states defying federal authority. That's just the president disagreeing with how a state is handling a local issue. Now, let's talk about what actually happens next. The Supreme Court heard arguments. They're deliberating. And sometime, probably in the next few months, we're going to get a decision. And there are basically three possible outcomes. Outcome 1. The court sides with Illinois. They say no, the president doesn't have unlimited authority to deploy troops without state consent. Trump's deployment gets blocked, and we maintain something closer to the traditional balance between federal and state power. This would be a huge loss for Trump, but it would preserve constitutional norms. Outcome 2. The court sides with Trump, but issues a narrow ruling. They say, okay, in this specific situation, with these specific facts, the president's authority applies, but they don't establish a broad precedent about presidential power. This would be a win for Trump practically, but it wouldn't necessarily open the floodgates for future presidents. Outcome 3. The court sides with Trump and issues a broad ruling affirming sweeping presidential authority to deploy troops domestically. This is the nightmare scenario for people worried about executive overreach, because it would essentially greenlight any future president to send federal forces into states whenever they decide it's necessary. And honestly, based on how this court has been ruling lately, Outcome 3 feels way more possible than it should. That 90% statistic keeps bouncing around in my head because courts are supposed to be unpredictable. They're supposed to rule based on law, not based on who appointed them. But when you're winning 9 out of 10 cases, something else is going on. There's also a political dimension here that we can't ignore. The 2026 midterms are coming, and this case is going to be front and center. Democrats are already using it to argue that Trump is authoritarian, that he's shredding constitutional norms, that he's a threat to democracy. Republicans are going to argue that Trump is just trying to restore law and order, that democratic cities are out of control, that someone needs to step in. And depending on how the court rules, one of those narratives is going to get a massive boost. If the court sides with Illinois, Trump looks like he overreached and got slapped down. That's bad for Republicans in the midterms. But if the court sides with Trump, especially with a broad ruling, Democrats are going to run on stopping federal military deployments to cities. That's going to energize their base like crazy. So there are real electoral stakes here, on top of the constitutional ones. And that's probably why we're seeing governors like Newsom being so aggressive about this case. They know it's not just about Chicago. It's about whether Democrats can paint Trump as an authoritarian threat, or whether Trump can claim he's just being tough on crime. But let's zoom out for a second, because beyond the immediate political battles, beyond the legal arguments, this case is really about something deeper. It's about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want a system where the president has vast unilateral authority to deploy military force domestically? Or do we want a system where that power is checked, where states have a say, where local communities can resist federal overreach? And I know some of you are thinking, well, it depends on the situation. If there's a real crisis, if local authorities really can't handle it, then maybe federal intervention is necessary. And okay, sure, but that's what the Insurrection Act is for. That's what emergency powers are for. Those laws already exist. They already give the president authority in genuine emergencies. This case is about whether the president needs those laws or whether he can just bypass them and do whatever he wants. And that's a fundamentally different question. Here's the other thing that worries me. Once you normalize federal troops in American cities, it's really hard to go back. Right now, seeing military forces patrolling domestic streets feels shocking. It feels wrong. But if the Supreme Court says it's fine, if it becomes a regular tool that presidents use, then we stop being shocked. It becomes normal. And that normalization, that's how democratic norms erode. Not all at once, but slowly, precedent by precedent, until one day you wake up and realize the country operates completely differently than it used to. So, here's the bottom line. This Supreme Court case matters. It matters way more than most people realize. It's not just about Chicago. It's not just about Trump. It's about whether we're going to allow a massive expansion of presidential power or whether we're going to maintain the constitutional checks that have defined American government for over 2 centuries. And the scariest part? We're about to find out which path the Supreme Court chooses. And once they decide, there's no going back. The precedent will be set. The power will be established. And every president from here on out, whether you love them or hate them, will have access to whatever authority the court grants. So yeah, pay attention to this one, because what happens next could reshape America for generations. And we all need to be ready for whatever comes after the court makes this call. This is one of those moments where history gets written, and we're all just watching it happen in real time. Think about it this way. Every major shift in American government, every major expansion of federal power, it didn't happen all at once. It happened through cases like this, through precedents that seem reasonable at the time, but open doors that nobody could close later. This case has that same energy. It feels like we're standing at a crossroads, and the path the court chooses is going to determine what America looks like for the next 50 years. Are we going to be a country where the president can send troops into cities at will? Where state sovereignty takes a backseat to executive authority? Where the Supreme Court consistently approves expansions of presidential power? Or are we going to hold the line? Are we going to say that some powers are too dangerous to grant, regardless of who's in office? Because here's what keeps me up at night. If Trump gets this authority and then loses in 2028, what happens when the next president has the same power? What happens when someone you really don't trust can deploy federal troops anywhere they want? Are you still going to think it's a good idea? Or are you going to wish we stopped this before it became precedent? That's the question everyone needs to be asking. Not do I trust Trump, but do I trust every future president with this power? Because once it's granted, it doesn't go away. And that's what makes this Supreme Court decision so incredibly important. It's not about one city, it's not about one president, it's about the fundamental structure of American government and whether we're willing to change it in ways we might not be able to undo. So buckle up. The Supreme Court is deliberating, and soon we're all going to find out what kind of country we're living in. Whether we're still the America where states have rights and presidents have limits, or whether we're becoming something else entirely. Something where executive power reigns supreme and the courts just nod along. And honestly, I'm not sure which way this goes, but we're about to find out. And whatever happens is going to change everything.